One statement from Stefon Diggs has suddenly created a conversation that Steelers fans probably were not expecting at this stage of the offseason. The former All-Pro wide receiver publicly challenged every team's number 2 receiver across the NFL, making it clear that he believes nobody currently holding that role is better than he is. And when you apply that statement to Pittsburgh, the discussion immediately shifts toward one specific player, Michael Pittman Jr. Diggs made his opinion crystal clear. He argued that if every team's true number 1 receiver is removed from the conversation, there isn't a single second option around the league that surpasses him. Naturally, that puts the spotlight directly on Pittsburgh's current receiver room, where DK Metcalf is firmly established as the number 1 target, leaving Michael Pittman Jr. as the projected second receiver entering the season. On paper, Stefon Diggs certainly has the resume to back up his confidence. He is a 2-time first-team All-Pro, a 4-time Pro Bowler, and despite being 32 years old, he is coming off another productive season. Last year with the New England Patriots, Diggs posted a PFF grade above 82 while catching 85 passes for more than 1,000 receiving yards and 4 touchdowns. Even more impressive is the fact that he accomplished those numbers while playing only around 55% of the offensive snaps. When you project his production over the type of snap share he has traditionally received throughout his career, the numbers become even more remarkable, potentially exceeding 130 receptions, 500 receiving yards, and 6 touchdowns. That production reminds everyone why Diggs has remained one of the league's most respected route runners. Even though he may not possess the same explosiveness he had during his peak years with the Minnesota Vikings and Buffalo Bills, his technical ability has never disappeared. His route precision, reliable hands, and ability to consistently move the chains continue to make him an extremely effective NFL receiver. Those traits are exactly why he still believes he belongs among the best secondary receiving options in football. But this conversation becomes much more interesting once you compare him directly with Michael Pittman Jr. Looking strictly at last season's statistics, both receivers actually played exactly the same number of passing snaps, giving fans a very fair comparison. Diggs finished with slightly better overall production in several receiving categories, including yardage and efficiency. Pittman, however, held the advantage in one critical area: touchdowns. His larger frame and physical playing style allowed him to become a much bigger red zone weapon, and he finished the season by setting a new personal career high in receiving touchdowns. However, there is another layer to Pittman's season that cannot be ignored. His production changed dramatically after Indianapolis lost starting quarterback Daniel Jones in Week 14 against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Once the quarterback situation changed, Pittman's numbers naturally declined as the offense struggled with consistency. Before that injury, Pittman was on pace for approximately 90 receptions, around 900 receiving yards, and 9 touchdowns. Projecting those numbers over a full healthy season paints a much different picture than simply looking at the final stat sheet. In that scenario, Pittman likely would have finished with more receptions than Diggs, while more than doubling his touchdown total. That context makes this comparison far less one-sided than many people initially assume. The reality is that both players offer completely different skill sets. Diggs wins with separation, timing, elite route running, and football intelligence. Pittman wins with size, physicality, contested catches, and red zone effectiveness. Depending on what an offense values most, either receiver could be viewed as the better fit. Even so, if someone simply asks which player might currently be the slightly better overall receiver based purely on football ability, there is certainly an argument in Diggs' favor. His consistency over the course of his career, combined with another productive season, makes it understandable why he continues to believe he belongs ahead of many players currently holding the number 2 role. But being the better player on paper is only part of the equation. The much bigger question for Pittsburgh is whether any of this actually makes sense for the Steelers. Would bringing in Stefon Diggs improve the roster enough to justify changing the current plan? Or has Omar Khan already built this receiver room exactly the way he wants it heading into training camp? That is where this debate becomes far more complicated, because evaluating talent is one thing, but building an entire roster requires much more than simply adding another recognizable name. So before we continue into everything that could prevent this move from becoming reality, I want to hear from Steelers Nation. If you had to choose today, who would you rather have as Pittsburgh's number 2 receiver, Michael Pittman Jr. or Stefon Diggs, and why? The answer, at least based on everything surrounding Pittsburgh's current roster construction, is probably no. That might sound surprising after acknowledging that Stefon Diggs could still be viewed as a slightly better receiver than Michael Pittman Jr., but building an NFL roster is never as simple as collecting the biggest names available. Every acquisition has to fit financially, schematically, and culturally, and that's exactly where this situation becomes much more complicated for the Steelers. The first obstacle is the way this offense is expected to operate. Pittsburgh appears ready to feature plenty of 12 personnel, meaning 2 tight ends will frequently be on the field together, particularly on early downs. That philosophy alone changes the entire conversation. When 2 tight ends are part of the formation, there are usually only 2 wide receivers on the field. Right now, those 2 projected starters are DK Metcalf and Michael Pittman Jr. That isn't an accident. The organization has already invested heavily in Pat Freiermuth and Darnell Washington, giving both tight ends significant contracts. Teams simply do not commit that kind of money to players they don't intend to feature. It strongly suggests that the coaching staff views the tight end combination as one of the biggest strengths of the offense, and it would make little sense to dedicate major resources to a third veteran receiver who would spend large portions of the game watching from the sideline. Even if Diggs were willing to join Pittsburgh, another question immediately follows. Would he actually accept becoming the third receiving option? Everything about his public comments suggests that he still views himself as one of the league's premier receivers. His recent statement wasn't made by someone comfortable accepting a reduced role. He challenged every team's number 2 receiver because he believes he deserves to be in that conversation himself. Joining a roster where he would likely rotate behind DK Metcalf and Michael Pittman Jr. simply doesn't seem like the situation he would be searching for. From Pittsburgh's perspective, it creates another problem. Michael Pittman Jr. was brought in specifically to fill that number 2 role. The Steelers are already paying him like a legitimate starter. Moving him into a reduced workload shortly after making that financial commitment would create unnecessary roster imbalance. It would essentially mean paying starting caliber money to a receiver who would no longer receive starting caliber opportunities. Then comes the salary cap. The Steelers currently have limited financial flexibility remaining. While there is still some available cap space, additional expenses remain before the regular season begins. Rookie contracts still have to be finalized, practice squad salaries must be accounted for, and the final spots on the active roster also carry financial obligations. Those remaining costs reduce the amount of money Pittsburgh can realistically dedicate to another veteran free agent. Could the Steelers create more space? Yes. Contract restructures remain an option, and financially the organization could make a signing like this work if it truly believed Diggs completed the roster. But restructures come with consequences. Every dollar pushed into future seasons creates larger cap commitments later, and that becomes much more significant when several young players are expected to receive increasingly expensive contracts over the coming years. Creating flexibility today can reduce flexibility tomorrow, and that is a calculation every front office must carefully consider. There is also another factor that may actually be the biggest reason for patience. The Steelers still need answers from their young receivers. Jeremy Bernard enters his rookie season with considerable expectations, while Roman Wilson is still trying to establish himself as a reliable contributor. Training camp represents a critical evaluation period for both players. Rather than immediately spending additional money on another veteran, Pittsburgh has an opportunity to see whether either young receiver can seize the WR3 role naturally. If one or both players develop chemistry with Rodgers, the need for another experienced receiver becomes much smaller. If they struggle, however, the situation changes completely. That may explain why waiting until later in training camp, or even closer to the preseason finale, could make much more sense than making a move today. By then, the coaching staff will have much clearer answers regarding Bernard's readiness, Roman Wilson's development, and how comfortable Aaron Rodgers feels working with the younger members of the receiving corps. That last point cannot be overlooked. Rodgers has earned a reputation throughout his career for demanding exceptional precision from his receivers. Timing, route discipline, adjustments, and football intelligence have always been non-negotiable in his offenses. Veteran receivers typically adapt much faster to those expectations than rookies do. If Pittsburgh reaches the end of training camp and discovers that its younger receivers aren't progressing quickly enough, the front office could revisit the veteran market with far more information than it has today. And if that scenario unfolds, there would still be experienced options potentially available. Rather than rushing into a decision now, the Steelers can evaluate the roster first and only pursue outside help if it becomes absolutely necessary. Viewed through that lens, Pittsburgh's current approach makes perfect sense. The organization isn't necessarily closing the door on adding another veteran receiver. Instead, it's choosing to let competition play out before spending valuable cap space or disrupting a roster that already appears carefully constructed around its current offensive identity. For now, the Steelers seem comfortable trusting the combination of DK Metcalf, Michael Pittman Jr., their talented tight end duo, and a group of younger receivers fighting to earn meaningful roles. Whether that